Humans hurt, the environmental harm caused by global human activity. Hello, I'm Paul Carpuzis, and today I'll be speaking from the environmental lens.
I'm Marie Flinchball, I'll be speaking from the ethical lens.
I'm Jacob Johnson, I'll be speaking through the cultural lens.
Before we dive into our research, I would like to talk about an event that took place in April of 2010. The United States has been responsible for a few infamous oil spills that leaked directly into the ocean, but the worst was the British petroleum spill in the Gulf of Mexico, known as the BP oil spill. An ignorant worker put a valve on the oil well backwards, leading to the largest leakage of oil in the world. Government-appointed scientists did tests on the Gulf of Mexico to determine how much oil had leaked, and over a span of 12 weeks, over 206 million gallons of oil was free-floating in the homes of thousands of living creatures. 12 whole weeks passed before action was taken to close or contain the source of the oil. Incidents like these raise the question, to what extent does human activity harm the environment? Human activity harms the environment through poaching, habitat destruction, and resource waste. If we create more safe areas for animals, more laws that punish those who endanger the lives of animals, and refuse to waste food, more awareness will rise to the issues that are endangering animals at a large scale. Now to Jacob with the cultural lens.
Thanks, Paul. Through the cultural lens, I learned about a poaching subculture that is still in practice today. Poaching is defined as illegally hunting or catching game that is not on one's contravention of official protection. India Burke, an environmental writer and editorial assistant, talks about how rhinos and elephants are poached for their horns and tusks. They contain ivory, which is rumored to have the ability to cure hangovers quickly, and is also said to have anti-cancer properties. Poachers see those properties as an opportunity to get rich quickly, so they poach and sell the horns to the trafficking industry. The industry is estimated to be worth between $7 and $23 billion. The elephant and rhino both fall victim to excessive poaching to reach those numbers. Burke states that there are 20,000 elephants that are poached yearly, and the black rhino has already gone completely extinct. If the poaching rate of elephants persists, they will soon follow the same track as the black rhino. The author of State Wildlife and Conservation, Thomas Ryder, proposes a solution to have more state wildlife reserves to protect animals. This would allow animals to live in an environment where they don't face any harm from humans, and this would help endangered populations recover from excessive poaching and other endangering factors such as habitat destruction. This solution can only be effective if states enforce laws surrounding conservation lands. Now back to Paul with the environmental lens.
Thank you, Jacob. The United States emits one of the largest amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, which accelerates climate change. Climate change has driven many Arctic animals out of their homes due to rapid decay of Arctic and Antarctic territories. The largest ice sheet on Earth is Antarctica, which is over 2 kilometers thick in some parts. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA, has used satellites and tests to determine Antarctica's changing ice mass since 2002. NASA's data shows an alarming 127 gigatons of ice melting on average every year. That is over 100 billion tons of ice melting at the feet of polar bears who depend on it for their survival. Dr. Wayne Seung, an environmental advocacy lawyer, writes about climate change and its effects on Arctic life. He explains that polar bears depend heavily on Arctic sea ice for their survival, so when the ice melts, polar bears must move northwards to find more stable platforms because they're in danger of breaking through partially melted ice if they do not migrate. However, moving northwards creates more problems for the bears. Polar bears rarely succeed hunting in open waters, and if they fail to obtain food, they can starve. If a pregnant polar bear is malnourished, its kids have a much lower chance of survival following birth. All of these negative effects on polar bears rise from the United States emitting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Tobias Thorns is in a doctoral training program for environmental research. Thorns says that climate change harming animals is only just beginning, and it will become increasingly difficult for animals to cope with the changes to living conditions. In order to stop this dilemma, legal action must be taken to protect animals that are suffering. None of the United States laws have ever given animals the rights of a person. Shockingly, United States companies are classified by the government as legal persons with rights and liabilities. They can go to court as an individual entity. Animal rights lawyer Leslie Bisgold talks about what kind of national protection animals should be given by the law. Bisgold does not want to extend human rights to animals, only establish the right to have their fundamental interests respected when we consider taking actions that will affect them, their fundamental interests being their survival. Bisgold insists that if humans change animals' legal status from property to legal person, then there will be consequences for humans that put them in danger. Consequences for humans endangering animals will bring more attention to the environment, to how the environment is being treated, and humans will take action to not let any more disasters harm animals. I will now turn your attention to Marie with the ethical lens.
Thanks, Paul. My research led me to realize that humans need to minimize their environmental impact by monitoring their use of resources. Food waste is defined as the discardment of edible mass by producers and consumers. Tristram Stewart, author of Waste, Uncovering the Global Food Waste Scandal, estimates that farmers discard up to 1/3 of their crop because of visual quality standards in supermarkets. Retailers are under the assumption that consumers will not buy products that do not adhere to a strict visual standard. These standards are much more prevalent in commercial supermarkets than local venues. Michael Pollan, author of The Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food, credits consumers for the increase in local and organic venues. Pollan and Stewart agree that consumers have the power to stop the senseless waste of food. Guibert de Marmol, author of No Time to Waste, writes from an ethical lens and asserts that morality forbids careless consumer waste because that waste harms animals and humans of the earth. Gracia Calabro and Simone Vieri write in their book, Food Waste, that 38% of all power used in agriculture yearly is consumed by harvest that is eventually lost or wasted. These gross inefficiencies lead to a perceived need for more natural resources, which contributes to habitat destruction and environmental harm. Since consumers have the power to stop the waste of food resources, they are ethically bound to do so. Overall, the problem of food waste needs to be solved at a consumer level. Within households, consumers need to follow Stewart's advice and just sit down and eat food rather than throwing it away. While this shift in consumer mindset is possible, it is difficult to quantify. However, if consumers regard wasting food as socially unacceptable and act upon those convictions, companies will be forced to adhere to a higher moral standard rather than a superficial visual one. Now to Jacob for a counterclaim.
Thanks, Marie. There are approximately 7.7 billion humans on the planet, and that number is constantly increasing. People assume that humans need to consume more natural resources to support the growing population. Harmful human actions are justified by necessity for the survival of the growing population. Each speaker has illustrated the careless nature of many detrimental human actions, yet solutions that justify resource waste are still encouraged. The UXL Encyclopedia of Science addresses a large population and states that, quote, humans are a growing population that needs more resources compared to wild animals, end quote. The need for food resources encourages intensive farming. In theory, this method conserves land, but in practice, it depletes soil and destroys habitats, so it is not a viable solution. Now back to Marie with our team solution.
Overall, human carelessness is the culprit for environmental harm. Jacob proposed establishing more protected lands to allow animal populations to recover. Paul recommends approving legislation that punishes those companies who harm animals, and I encourage a change in consumer behavior relating to food resources. However, as a group, we realize that it is impossible to instate these solutions if humans continue to act irresponsibly. For example, in the BP oil spill, animal harm could have been completely avoided if human mistakes had not occurred. Wildlife can be conserved, habitat destruction eliminated, and food waste reduced if awareness is raised for environmental issues. This awareness cannot come in the form of vague public service announcements. It must address specific environmental problems that have realistic solutions. Unfortunately, raising awareness relies on people educating themselves, but it is a prerequisite for initiating the solutions these problems require. In our modern age, it is feasible to educate ourselves and others through online activism. By acting and speaking out, humans have the ability to work toward the solutions these problems require. Overall, to reduce animal harm, humans need to allocate more natural resources to animals. Designating protected tracts of land, establishing laws that police animal endangerment, and conserving food resources will drastically reduce the harm done to animals by humans. Thank you.
All right, folks, thank you. Paul, we're going to start with you first. Okay. How did the group decide to include Marie's perspective into the overall presentation?
So my paper focused strictly on habitat destruction, and Jacob went into habitat destruction a little bit and talked about poaching. So we were very similar. Marie took a different perspective on wasting food for animals, considering me and Jacob were more direct harm to animals, and Marie has almost 3 steps to getting to the point where it harms animals. So it shows listeners that there's even ways you can harm animals that you don't usually think about that aren't as clear as habitat destruction or killing them.
Okay, thanks. Jacob, all right. What's an example of a compelling argument from one of your teammates here that you decided to exclude from the presentation?
For Marie, food waste, she went in and talked about, in this presentation, she talked about just overall food waste in general and how people discard food based off of how it looks, how it physically looks. But she excluded how people also discard food because of the way it goes bad. And she excluded that from this because she decided that it was, that there's a stronger argument in the physical looks.
Okay. All right, and finally, Marie, can you describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your overall solutions?
Like the boys mentioned before, I talk about a very indirect way of harming animals. So hearing about, in Jacob's paper, hearing about habitat destruction and poaching in a very direct sense, showed me the consequences of the effects that I was talking about. I was talking about habitat destruction as an effect of human behavior, and then Jacob was talking about effects of habitat destruction directly on animals. So I was able to see farther down the chain of events on what happens.
Okay. All right, folks, thanks.